Support for this podcast comes from the Utah Office of Tourism, announcing the Four Corners School of Outdoor Education. Located at 7,100 feet near the base of the Abajo Mountains in Monticello, Utah, the school's Canyon Country Discovery Center campus is an ideal location for your next tour or vacation. They invite you to visit and learn about Utah's unique canyon country through day trips or week-long adventures. More at fourcornerschool.org.
Blog Talk Radio.
Live to see it, friends, and welcome to The World Transformed. This program is your guide to an astounding future that lies ahead, one that will be here sooner than you think, and one that you have an important role to play in bringing about. At The World Transformed, we want to introduce you to what may be the biggest transformation of them all, the one that begins with considering and acting on the almost limitless possibilities that lie ahead, and that ends somewhere beyond the reach of the human imagination. So, when does this amazing future begin? Well, today is the day. My name is Phil Bowermaster, and with me in the virtual studio is my co-blogger, co-futurist, and co-host, Stephen Gordon. Hello, Stephen.
Hey, Phil. How are you?
Well, I'm super fantastic. We have got a spectacular show lined up. Of course, if you've seen the posts that we put up on worldtransform.com and over on Blog Talk Radio, we're going to be talking about mind uploading tonight, and our guest is Keith Wiley. Keith has a PhD in computer science from the University of New Mexico and was one of the original members of MERG, the Mind Uploading Research Group, an online community dating back to the mid-90s that discussed issues of consciousness with an aim toward mind uploading. He's written multiple chapters, peer-reviewed journal articles, and magazine articles, in addition to several essays on a broad array of topics available on his site. He's also an avid rock climber and a prolific classical piano composer, as well as an artist, and of course the author of the book that we're going to be discussing tonight. Keith Wiley, welcome to The World Transformed.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Well, we're thrilled to have you, and we're very excited to be talking about, I'll do this from memory, a taxonomy and metaphysics of mind uploading. Did I get it right?
You did. That is the full dry title.
That is the title. And I want to say, folks, first off, before we do anything else, that for a book with that title, this is a highly readable book, okay? This is a very accessible book. I'm going to say, Keith, even extremely entertaining in places. I just will call out one footnote about the meaning of the emblem on Superman's uniform that my mind was shrieking before I got to the footnote. Like, oh, this guy is simpatico. Okay, he gets it. And some other time, we got to remember to have this conversation. We won't have time for it tonight. But some other time, I want to provide a plausible scenario for how that could be both an S and a 5. Okay? So just
I can't wait for the audience to have any idea what we're talking about.
Read the book, folks. You'll know where we are. Absolutely. That's what you've got to do to find out about this. Well, so let's start just with the basics. Okay? We've got a taxonomy and metaphysics of mind uploading. Why? Why do we need this?
Well, the book, why do we need the book? The book serves two almost unrelated purposes, as named on the title. The first section of the book is really not philosophical speculation. It is a collection of thought experiments, a collection of hypothetical scenarios that have come up in a variety of circumstances, and these scenarios are ways by which mind uploading could hypothetically be achieved. Some of them have been created by science fiction authors. Some of them have been created by past futurists and written into their own futurist books. I'm referring to Hans Moravec's models. They've cropped up in movies, and then a lot of them are just thought experiments that come up in what I call the fog of debate. When people debate philosophy of mind, they're always like, oh, well, imagine you were uploaded this way, or imagine you were uploaded that way. And I actually pulled as many of these scenarios as I could possibly pull together, and then actually organized them topically in a certain way, just to make sort of a reference for other people to use to look up scenarios when they're pondering these issues. It's essentially a reference section. And
absolutely, and it works as a reference book. I must say that it's like, oh, okay, well, here's this and here's this, and okay.
Yeah, I definitely that first section. I think it's about a third of the book. I'm not sure. This taxonomy. I really want it to be a place where people who are curious in these questions can apply the taxonomy as a set of tests for their own philosophies, for their own perhaps beliefs. If someone has a theory about what they think a mind is and how a mind relates to a brain, I want them to be able to use the taxonomy to sort of poke around the edges of their theory, see if it stands up to the scrutiny that all these scenarios might pose, maybe use it to refine their theory, and if a person is confident in their theory, they should be able to use the taxonomy to bolster their arguments in future debates, because they'll sort of already be prepared for the 50-odd ways that might come up. So that's how the first section is intended. It's really not meant to advance my position. The second part of the book really argues for my theory. And the first part, I really want to be as open as possible. I tried. So the second part, as the title implies, Taxonomy and a Metaphysics of Mind Uploading. The second part of the book is my personal philosophy of mind. I think pretty much everyone has some notion of what they think this is. Even people who don't think about these topics very much sort of have a notion of what they think makes a person and makes them unique from other people and makes them unique from animals and maybe makes them unique from robots. Even people who don't think about this very much are ready to sort of entertain the validity of the questions. So I've thought about it quite a bit, and I've refined a relatively detailed description of how I think this all works. And the second part of the book basically lays out how I think minds and brains relate to each other, and of course with specific implications to how minds would be applied in uploading scenarios.
Absolutely. Okay, and we're gonna come back to and spend a lot of time on that philosophical section. By far and away my favorite part of the book, although I enjoyed all of it. The rigor I think that you apply to starting at the very beginning and working us through what you're talking about there is it's admirable, and it really works. But by the time we get to a mind space, and by the time we get to talking about I can't think of the term now, but the mind, not patterns, but it's the
mind states?
Yeah, mind states and brain states and all those terms as they're defined, it all makes sense and it all starts to add up. And then by doing that groundwork, it's like, oh, okay, well, we can talk intelligibly about these things. Although, I personally had to keep going back and go, oh yeah, okay, that's that. But it works. That's why the reference piece is so useful. But I want to come back and ask about how you got interested in this topic. But before we do, since we're talking a little bit about the taxonomy, you've got definitions in there for terms like brain and Aristotelian realism, and and then you give this very exhaustive list of scanning and uploading scenarios, which is really interesting. But I wonder, when you look at terms like that, are those really so contentious that they require the level of attention that you've given them? Is there really that much room for misunderstanding what those things are?
You would hope not, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
I have found in various debates, and I haven't engaged in too many official debates, on stage in front of an audience. I've done a whole lot of online discussions, because that's how everyone debates everything for the last 20 or 30 years.
Right.
And I have found in the sort of common method of discourse that the internet entails, basically back and forth, sort of email length or forum length messages, that the same things keep coming up. And one pattern I've noticed is that where people want to have high-level philosophical discussions, usually pretty early in a debate, people discover that they don't actually I don't even want to use words like agree and disagree. I want to say they don't understand one another's ways of using the same terms.
Right.
So when one person uses the word consciousness, they assume that everyone else in the room sort of knows what they're talking about, so they can talk about it without defining it first. And even simple things like brains. People think, okay, well, we all know what a brain is. We don't even have to define it. Let's discuss it. And in my experience, debates often become about clarifying one another's definitions for these words, and by the time you've gone around in circles on the definitions, the thread of the debate has sort of run its course, and you never actually get to the fun stuff.
Right.
So what I did is I've actually put the glossary of my book at the front. It's an extremely atypical way to do it. And
very daring, I must say. Very daring, a bold move, putting the glossary at the beginning. Yes.
Yeah, even some of my editors were nervous about that, but others were encouraging. And basically I took some of these terms that I intended to use throughout the book, and I just said, to heck with it. I'm actually going to define the word brain, even though it seems so obvious. And that way, anyone reading the book will know exactly how I mean it in the book.
Right.
And I'm not telling everyone else that they have to use the words exactly the way I do. It lays a groundwork for the book, so that when you read the book, you know what the heck I'm saying.
You know what? I would think that defining terms like that may forestall Godwin's law just a little bit. It keeps the forum from degenerating into name calling a little longer, perhaps, if you take the extra step as you did in the book. So that's a good thing. Yeah.
Get closer to the actual thing you want to talk about, right? Instead of all that kind of stuff. So let's talk a little bit about how'd you join up with MERG? How'd you get interested in this topic? What has driven you to spend a good part of your life now, I guess, thinking about and writing about this topic?
These are, of course, stories that have no true origin. I'd have to go all the way back. I will pick up in 1997. I had, at some point earlier than that, developed a fairly passionate interest in the field of artificial life and genetic algorithms, and this is relatively unrelated, except that it brought me to the Genetic Algorithms Conference in 1997. And perusing the books, in the vendors section, I came across this book by, I'm forgetting the other person's name, Cox, and I want to give him credit, by Gregory Paul and Earl Cox.
Okay.
Which was essentially a book written in 1996 about mind uploading before the term was even popular. A few people had written books about it earlier. Kurzweil had written a book, I believe, in his big book was 99, but I think he wrote another book earlier than that. But it was really sort of a nascent topic, and I read this book and it blew my mind, basically. It laid out two things that I really hadn't thought about seriously before. The idea of what mind uploading is, which incidentally we haven't actually defined yet for the audience.
No, we'll get there. Yeah. Stay tuned, folks. Yeah.
The idea was, everybody sort of already knew vaguely of the idea, but this book made it so much more visceral to me. All of a sudden I realized that it didn't have to be science fiction. It was really kind of, it made a certain sense, even in sort of a physicalist, scientific way. And the other thing the book did, which I don't touch on in this book directly, is it completely changed my mind about the likelihood of sentient or intelligent life within our galaxy. It totally changed my mind about that.
Interesting. Not what you would expect even to be addressed in that necessarily.
No, but the conclusions of where an exploration of mind uploading take you lead you to a certain set of led me and other authors to a set of conclusions about how easy it should be for an intelligent species to explore and also colonize and otherwise sort of leave really telltale signs of technological and artificial civilization sort of all over the cosmos. And not to go too off the rails with respect to what we're discussing.
That's a rabbit hole we could jump right down. Okay,
I won't go too far on that, but it does. Once you really take mind uploading to heart, once you really take the idea of computerized minds to heart, which is to say minds that are in sort of robust, engineered systems, substrates, all of a sudden it becomes really, really easy to travel through space over tremendous distances and over tremendous durations of time. All the things that make it hard for humans, all those problems go away. So then all of a sudden Fermi's paradox becomes much more severe. We shouldn't go any further than that, but it's a tangent. But those are the two things I took away from that book you asked me.
Well, absolutely. So, but did you end up thinking there is life out there or not? I'm unclear.
My opinion is that the likelihood of sort of life that is intelligent in the way that humans are within our own galaxy, I think, is smaller than most people estimate.
Right.
Some people who don't, understand the problem in enough detail think that that's an argument that there's no artificial life or intelligence or anything like that, which is ridiculous because there's
lots of other galaxies. Right. Yeah.
So I'm not arguing that we're unique. It's just much rarer within our galaxy than some people think.
Very interesting. Well, I'll tell you what. We'll have you back and we'll do a show just about that because that's
sure.
We have talked at length about that very topic more than once, and so yes, absolutely, we got to do that.
Well, there's so much in the book that we talk about all the time. I got to tell you, when I hit the phrase "hard problem of consciousness" in your book, I don't know, for Stephen and myself, this is an inside joke. We've talked about maybe we should just rename the show, and instead of calling it The World Transformed, we're just going to start calling it The Hard Problem of Consciousness, because we bump into it all the time on a lot of these topics. So
that's Chalmers' term, David Chalmers.
Right, and it is a hard problem, isn't it? We're going to
that's
go ahead.
Actually not quite what he means. We all think it's hard. We all think that we don't understand consciousness yet. He also, I think, as well as I claim to understand Chalmers, he's claiming that the hard problem of consciousness is possibly even sort of beyond basic scientific investigation. That he thinks that once you totally, completely, physically understand the brain, at a level of science and technology that we are centuries from, there still may remain these fundamental sort of philosophical questions that can't be grasped scientifically, which is the nature of things like what we call qualia, the notion that red sort of has a distinct red sort of sensation to you. The hard problem that Chalmers is referring to, if I may paraphrase him, is that we may never actually be able to figure out why red evokes a red sensation and green evokes a different one. It's this hard problem that science doesn't quite have a channel for studying it. And this is an issue of crucial concern in mind uploading sort of interpretation, because people get really concerned over whether those particular properties of a mind are going to survive various uploading scenarios.
Absolutely. Well, you've got the whole subjective nature of consciousness, which is almost like a tautology to say that. It is subjectivity. So consciousness is to say it's the most subjective thing is ridiculous too. It is subjectivity. It is this subjective thing that happens, right? To try to classify it, and then to try to understand it in scientific terms, in quote unquote objective terms, it's just it's chalk and cheese. I mean, I see what he's getting at, and that's another hard problem of consciousness. For us, the hard problem of consciousness is always that we end up spending the whole show on it, and then we don't have time for any other topics. I think that's.
Well, thankfully, it's pretty close to the topic.
Yeah, we're doing it tonight. We're there. We're all over it tonight. Hey, you know what? I'm jumping around on these questions because I changed the order up a little bit, but I want to come back to the taxonomy just for a minute because I had a follow up to the question about how many. Whether these terms needed all that level of attention, which is, would you say that there is one more than the others definition that you provide that's the most controversial, or are there a couple or three terms that you're kind of out on a limb with how you define them compared to how other people do?
Are you referring to the glossary or the terms in the taxonomy?
The glossary, or any term you use that you want to say. This is where I'm really out there.
Right. Let me think do I bend any terms in a way that would really rub people wrong? I think one, I think you hinted at this, was that I use the word brain in a variety of rather strange ways.
Yes.
I do use it in the way that everyone uses it, to refer to essentially a biological organ. But I also generalize the term to refer to any system that houses and what we could say runs a mind or produces a mind. And in that sense, I extend the word brain to these sort of futuristic computerized constructs that we're speculating here. So I include not only biological brains, but also two other kinds, what I call physical computerized brains, which are which represents sort of a network of little tiny processors, billions of them, and they are networked in a way which is physically analogous to the sort of the network topology of the brain, the way the neurons are wired up. Sort of a conglomerated overall physical system, which is, although electronic or perhaps photonic or something, is nevertheless sort of a physical structure. And then the other major category is essentially various kinds of simulations. The idea that on what might be a fairly conventional computer, albeit much more powerful, you could run a simulation or an emulation of the way the brain works. And I use the word brain to describe that system simply because I use the word brain to describe anything from which I think a mind could arise. So I actually have, if I may recall, I actually have 5 specific levels. I said 3, but of those 5, 3 of them are basically kinds of simulations. So I have the biological brain. I have what I call physical computerized brains, as I said, sort of networks of billions of little processors. And then I have what I call a virtual structural brain, which is a simulation it's essentially a 3-dimensional simulation of all the neurons in the 3-dimensional locations that they are in the brain. I call that sort of the level 3. I have the 4th level, which I call a virtual functional brain, which is the closest of the 5 to what we call a conventional artificial neural network, the kind of neural networks that researchers have been working with since the 60s. Basically, something which in software emulates the topology of a network, but not really with any regard to 3-dimensional locations of neurons. Normal neural networks, for the audience, take the canonical notion of what a neuron is with its connections to other neurons, and it just attaches these things up in software mathematically, but they don't really have any simulated location. And then the last level, the 5th level, is also a simulation in my mind, but it's just the idea that we might be able to abstract higher than neurons, the idea that we might be able to model brains at much higher levels of computation. Ideas that come up are what neurologists call receptive fields, cortical columns, the idea that there are neurally encoded frequency filter banks, say in our audio system, Gabor wavelets are in our retinal system. These are basically words that refer to a whole bunch of neurons, maybe tens of thousands of neurons, which all act kind of as a unit to accomplish some tiny little bit of neural processing. And the only point of this 5th level of the brain is just to speculate that maybe we could emulate brains at these sort of higher levels of kinds of computations instead of dropping down to individual neurons.
To use the computer analogy, that would be you can use Python rather than machine language, or is that the kind of the idea?
The level of abstraction at which you describe some underlying system. And again, I really tried to write the book to be as accommodating as possible to the various philosophies of the readers. A lot of readers would absolutely reject that 5th level I described as really capturing an individual person. If you created an upload of a person but only encoded them at a level of detail of sort of groups of thousands of neurons acting sort of in concert, a lot of people would say that you have failed to really transfer the person, even if the resulting simulation behaves indistinguishably from them. A lot of people would just say no, it's some sort of an artificial doppelganger. It doesn't count. And I try not to take a stance on that in the book. I offer these different definitions of the brain just so that I can bring them up when and where it's relevant in the book, so that I have a clear, grounded terminology to rest on. But I'm not prescribing one or the other as the correct way to do this. We eventually do it. I think it's way too early for us to really put our flags in the soil on that.
What you give is you give the types, and then you run them all through various scenarios, right? You say, well, this one kind of works with this, and this one potentially works with that. And never losing sight of the fact that ultimately all we're talking about is, finally, if this isn't too simplistic, a brain is a thing that a mind can run on, right?
Yes. Yeah. A brain is either the system or the substrate or the simulation from which the canonical notion of a mind arises.
Yeah. So if it ends up that any three of them never pan out, two of them, everything in the book still applies, right?
Sure.
Ultimately.
Well, Keith, you don't prescribe a method, but let's just imagine it's 100 years from now, and the doctors come to you and say, we've done all we can to keep your body rejuvenated. It's now time to upload you. Which method are you most comfortable with? Given the, I understand in 100 years we all hope to know a lot more, right? But
that's an awesome question, Stephen. Yeah, the doctor hands you a menu of options, and it's all the choices you describe in the book, right? Which one are you going to use?
You're holding my feet to the fire on this. I agree with the general sentiment that the version of uploading called gradual in-place replacement is on some level the most it seems the least problematic on some level, whereas other methods, namely an entire section of the taxonomy, which I refer to as scan and copy, which are these methods of what makes them a little bit more contentious is that they're easier to contort into a way in which you end up with multiple uploads, or in which the original biological brain and person survive. More people are less comfortable with that. Now, just to be clear, the way I break down the taxonomy, even the gradual in-place replacement scenario where the brain within the skull is actually physically slowly replaced by tiny little artificial neurons until there's nothing left of the original biological brain. One thing I do in the taxonomy is I tear that analogy to shreds one step at a time, sort of taking it from the easy-to-understand model into in various directions which demonstrate that it doesn't have to be as philosophically distinguished from the scan and copy modes. You can morph these various thought experiments into essentially being the same on the physicalist level, which then leaves you with much more open metaphysical interpretations. But that said, you asked me which one anyone is generally more comfortable with. It's certainly hard to get away from the fact that if you could just replace the brain and slowly sort of dissolve the brain at the same time, there's a sense of not having to deal with the copy issue. Since I'm able to demonstrate through the taxonomy that ultimately that conclusion is paradoxical, that it actually doesn't really quite make sense, I would in fact be comfortable with any of the modes of uploading that preserve these mindful properties. And ultimately, I think that the big question is how you interpret the result, not what a person is sort of willing to submit themselves to, because people may choose to submit or not submit to certain procedures based on essentially incorrect assumptions, which means it doesn't really matter what they're comfortable with because they might be wrong. If someone thought that heart surgery was going to kill them, not out of its danger, but out of some sort of philosophical feeling that if you do heart surgery, the person dies and some sort of doppelganger replaces them. If someone believed that, who cares? They'd be wrong. What difference does it make what they're comfortable with? Ultimately, there's some truth here, and we'd like to get closer to the truth and then prescribe that people follow the more truthful methods, even if they're not comfortable with them.
I think, one of the things that struck me as I was reading the book, and I'm with you, by the way, in terms of the first one that comes to mind is the kind of gradual one. It just feels like there's less to worry about if you're awake the whole time and you're sort of, participating in it. I don't know. I probably feel the same way about any form of major surgery.
Actually, if I could break in for a moment, it's definitely not the awake business. In fact, one of the easiest ways to make most of the philosophical questions go away is to be unconscious, because if you imagine that the scenario proceeds by, essentially you going under some sort of anesthesia, and then you wake up in an upload, that actually makes the interpretation a lot cleaner, because we go to sleep and wake up and we go under anesthesia and come back so often that actually that that way of shutting our consciousness down and then waking it back up again is so comfortable to us that I actually think that might be the best way to do it. Instead of trying to come up with some sort of convoluted technological and medical procedure that, uploads us while we're awake, which just seems unbelievably, the technical challenges alone are just unbelievable. Why even bother with that? Why not go under general anesthesia, have them do whatever the heck they're going to do to you? Then you wake up, you feel exactly the same, and you're uploaded, and it's done. I mean, I think that's almost more comfortable. And, more crucially, that technology will probably be available a lot sooner. The scan and copy technology, whether or not people like it, from a philosophical point of view, will be technically feasible a lot sooner than gradual replacement. So.
Yeah, the thing about the destructive scan, and I've got some scenarios I want to run past you with non-destructive scans in a few minutes. But the problem with that destructive scan, I've got to say, is that word destructive. That feeling that something's ending, something else is starting, and are we really, really, really making the trip? Now you deal with this at length, and I have to say,
actually the point of the book.
Yeah, well, exactly, and I don't disagree with any of the arguments. But I'd still be more comfortable doing the gradual thing. I have to say that's kind of where I end up. Which one of the kind of revelations I had reading the book is particularly when we start talking about mind types and when you start explaining. I don't even know if we'll have time to get into this, but one of the just bummers of the book, I think, is the idea that there are no alternate versions of me. There's just other people, right? They're not they're not other versions of me. But
that's deep into the metaphysics.
Yes, but as I'm reading that, I'm going, okay, I see that. That makes sense. I understand that, and I realized that I probably am not in a position as a brain type and a token, and we'll get into that in just a second. To make the best decisions about this, you know what I mean? It's like I might have a slightly skewed perspective on the type because I'm sitting here in token land. And in fact, let's go there. Stephen, did you get to the metaphysics section of the book?
I did not.
Okay, well, perfect. No, this is great because now Keith's going to explain this most difficult part in like 30 seconds. Take us, if you could, just give us like the Reader's Digest version of types and tokens and brain states and mind states and how these concepts work together.
30 seconds, you said.
No, take your time.
So I really do start at the bottom of metaphysics. I don't really start with brains or philosophy of mind at all. I start with what Plato and Aristotle debated is the notion of types and tokens, types and occurrences of types. Universals and particulars are the other ways that some philosophers use it. So types are basically this notion that you can categorize or group kinds of common things or canonical types of things, like, almost anything. I mean, flowers are a type, and sentences are a type, and numbers are a type, and dogs are a type. It's just a way of categorizing ideas and things. And then this notion of occurrences basically comes in when a type becomes instantiated. The simplest kinds of occurrences are called tokens, and they are physical instantiations of things. So, you've got the notion of a rose type, which is just kind of the idea of a rose. And then you have a rose token, which is a rose in front of you that you're holding, a physical rose. So this is the idea of types and tokens. And Plato and Aristotle disagreed on whether types exist if there are no tokens for them. Plato said essentially that they do. So the types for roses would exist even if there weren't any roses. Aristotle held that types are basically only brought into existence and pushed out of existence as tokens, come into existence and go away. So as soon as the first rose appears, the rose type exists, and if the last token disappears, the rose type vanishes. So Plato and Aristotle have these very different philosophical positions on this. Personally, I have a much more Platonic view. I feel that the types are sort of never-ending and sort of disconnected from their actual instances. So from that, I get into what the abstract parts of the discussion here are, which are, of course, sort of things like minds, and what the concrete things are, which are the brains. And anyone can see that I'm going to basically say that brains are sort of a token and minds are sort of a type, and that there is a relationship where brains are sort of a token of a mind type. I get much more complicated on it because I have to get into the temporal dimension. A lot of things that we sort of think of as quick, simple examples are very concrete. Apples are pretty concrete things. Apples do grow and apples do rot, but they do it pretty slowly. When you think about an apple, you sort of see kind of a static thing. So thinking of an apple token as being of an apple type is kind of a static idea. In order to really seriously consider brains and minds, I have to take that temporal dimension much more seriously. And I actually have a very specific way of laying it out. I say that first I describe brain states, which are the physical, structural configuration of a brain at some level of detail, say atomic, at an exact instant in time. So your brain has a brain state right now, and it has a different brain state right now, and so on and so on.
Right.
Now, associated with a brain state, I use the word mind state. And I have to be careful here because psychologists and neuroscientists use the word mind state already, and they don't mean it the way I mean it. They often mean mind state to refer to some idea you might hold in your head. So if you were holding the idea of a pine tree, that would be a mind state you could have. I use the word completely differently, unfortunately. For me, the word mind state is the analogy, is the sister of the brain state. So if a brain state is the entire structural configuration of your brain at a moment, then the mind state is your entire mental configuration at a moment. It's every single thing there is about you. It's not just one thought you're having. So it's different in that sense. Now, with brain states and mind states laid out, then I add the temporal dimension. So I say that a brain is not the idea of a brain state, one brain at a moment in time, like you're looking at it. A brain is actually something that exists across time. In fact, by my definition, a brain is a temporal thing. It only exists within sort of this, I hesitate to say it, the fourth sort of temporal dimension. That's what it is. And then, of course, I refer to a mind as a sequence of mind states. So again, the mind is kind of a temporal thing. It only exists within time. So I got these four terms: brain states, mind states, brains and minds, and that's the relationship between them. And I then sort of chase this off in different directions to see what kind of things you can do to brains and do to brain states in the context of mind uploading. But that's kind of how I lay it all out.
So is my mind, your mind, anybody's mind, is it a type or is it an instance, an occurrence of that particular type?
You can have both. I do think of them originally first as a type. There is I take this notion of sort of anything, any idea that you can hold, and first I hold it as a type, just an abstract, ungrounded, uninstantiated idea. And then from there you go to occurrences of it. So, for example, the brain state, which is this physical structure, is described by some blueprint of its structure, and the blueprint is information. It's data. The way you could store the structural description of anything. So the description of a brain state is not a physical thing. It's just sort of information, and that information is the type. I reduce the whole thing essentially to sequences of bits, zeros and ones, the same kind of information we store in computers. So, there is some sequence of zeros and ones that describes the structural state of your brain state, and that type, that very long number, is a Platonic type. It's essentially a number.
Right.
And coupled with it, there is this mind state, which is a description of your entire state of mind associated with that brain state. And the mind state is also a type, which is described by some sort of very, very long number. Everything is described as long numbers, essentially. These things become instantiated essentially in association with tokenized brain states, and associated with a brain state, that is to say your brain at some moment in time, there is also the metaphysical sort of sibling of it, the mind state at the moment in time. So this is where it gets really complicated. I haven't told you about the third thing. We've got types, we've got tokens, but there is this third thing, which I call abstract occurrences, and I didn't invent the term. This is part of sort of metaphysical parlance. Abstract occurrences are occurrences of things that are not physical occurrences. So, when I ask you to hold the number 123 in your mind momentarily, you have basically brought into being sort of an occurrence of that number that you are now thinking about. But it's clearly not tokenized. It's not physical. It's not written on paper. But nevertheless, that number now exists somewhere. We have essentially instantiated the type that represents the 123 type. So it's an abstract occurrence.
Or if you said, think of a dog, right? Same thing.
Think of a picture of a dog. You've got this picture in your mind of a dog. It does always help to sort of make things visual. That's a good example. Who is it?
Mine's playing poker, by the way.
I think
naturally it would be, yes.
It's either Chalmers or Dennett. I don't recall who starts describing a purple elephant that you're imagining, and he's talking about how this thing exists or doesn't exist, because, which is it? So philosophers often refer to this concept as an abstract occurrence. And of course, not on the spot and not on the microphone. I hope I explain this a little bit more clearly in the book, but you'll have to tell me whether I succeeded. At any rate, that's how it all plays out. It's these types and these tokens, and they exist also as sequences within time, and you have to take into account the temporal element because, a moment later it's not the same thing anymore, and that's a crucial aspect of how to sort of analyze and interpret minds and brains, the fact that they're constantly changing. So that's the whole sort of, that's the groundwork of what I'm laying out for how I conceptualize how minds and brains relate to one another.
So as a reader, here's what I came away with, and I'm probably adding things that I wasn't allowed to add. But I see my mind then as an instance, an occurrence of a particular type, which may only exist in this one occurrence. Although I suppose it could exist in other occurrences if there's, Max Tegmark parallel universes beyond our cosmological horizon where this exact same universe is existing and I'm in it and I've had the exact same experiences. That me could be, two instances of that same mind. But short of that kind of crazy scenario, pretty much everybody is just like the lone instance of their mind type these days, right? I mean, that's...
Oh, yes, certainly.
Yeah.
It's essentially physically inconceivable that you could actually have two brains that are configured identically down to the atomic or even the neural scale. If you can't have two identical brains, you can't have two identical minds. Now, although this has never been an issue before, the whole point of mind uploading is that technologically it might become feasible in the future to create multiple tokens, multiple brains, which are structurally sufficiently identical to essentially encode the same mind. And this is where people philosophically get really wedded to their views. But the view that I hold, and it's not the more popular one in my experience, is that it is a valid concept to conceive of multiple physical brains referring not only to their own minds, but ostensibly to a single mind. And it's not a shared mind. It's not some sort of Borg collective. It's the idea that they actually refer to the exact same entity. This isn't too big a deal because as soon as you bring that temporal element back into it, which I keep pressing, all of a sudden this idea of similarity just evaporates. If you have two brains that are identical, and then look at them a thousandth of a second later, they're no longer identical.
It's like they can be identical as long as they're frozen. Until something happens, then you got two minds, two people, and two types. Is that right?
Yes. And this is a problem that comes up in sort of mind uploading debates, as people are always asking, well, if I upload someone, but the original survives, and you're looking at these two, people, one of them is a sort of a robotic upload, and the other one's the original, should we say they're the same person? And I would certainly never say that. That's ridiculous because they're conscious and existing in time. So clearly they've had different experiences from the moment they diverged. So they're different people, and I would never argue otherwise. The point that I make in the book toward the end is not some sort of argument that they're the same person. What I argue is simply that they share. A term I use is they have equal primacy to the identity. I'm trying to I had to come up with some way of saying that they're both equally entitled to consider themselves the person who went in for the procedure, essentially. this notion that you could have, multiple brains referencing the exact same mind is not too. I don't actually get hung up on it. You're right that if they were absolutely frozen and were never allowed to unfreeze and sort of continue, then I would say they refer to the same mind, but not really, because I think that for a mind to be, sort of what it is, it has to be temporal.
It's got to be going, yeah.
So long as they're frozen, I don't really consider that to be really sort of the mind anyway. It's just sort of a potential for the mind if you ever let it go again. Does that make sense?
Actually, it does. It makes perfect sense, and I want to talk about primacy. We're about 2/3 of the way through here, and I want to end on some. I'm going to challenge you with some thought experiments around primacy. But before we do that, maybe now it's finally appropriate to define what we mean by mind uploading, since we've been talking about
it. 50 minutes.
Yeah, you spend enough time on this. Here's what I'd like. I think most listeners of this program basically know what we're talking about. We're talking about a human mind somehow ending up in the computer substrate without putting too fine a point on it here. But I want to come at the definition this way, because there's some interesting things we do with terminology in your book, and I think it's very telling. Can you say a few words about if it's ever appropriate to say that a mind has been copied, or is it better to say it's been transferred? And then maybe you can introduce us to your idea of splitting.
Yeah. Again, this is really important, apparently. It comes up in debates all the time. People are very worried about the distinction between a transfer and a copy. Certainly, the way that we would describe the goal of mind uploading is with the word transfer. You want to try to transfer or move your mind from your brain to the computer. And in a gradual replacement scenario, you transfer it by essentially sort of slowly vaporizing the brain and transferring it to a computer that's growing inside your skull bit by bit. In a scan and copy, you more explicitly copy the structure of the brain into an artificial system, and then the interpretation is that the mind kind of went with it, and then that gets all hairy if the original survives, because how did it actually transfer? So then do you call that a copy? And people get hung up on this. What I say is that you don't really copy minds. What you copy is these, very long numbers, these bit strings that describe the structure of brains. And that's the only thing that you copy. I'm not too interested in copying minds. What you copy is the physical blueprint for building physical things like brains.
Right. And
whatever then arises metaphysically from these systems is. I don't describe that as a copy. I describe that as sort of, if you create a situation where you now have two identical physical things, say two identical physical brains, I wouldn't say that the mind in the first one was copied, but I wouldn't say that it was or was not transferred either. And it's just that they now each get, sort of a mind associated with each of them, and there's nothing wrong with saying that. If you want to interpret it as a transfer because your philosophy treats it that way, then that's fine. If you want to interpret it as a copy, I guess that's fine too. For me, the issue is not whether it is a successful transfer or whether it would be regarded as a failure because it's a copy, or we often think the word copy is sort of denigrated. Copies aren't as good as originals. They're not as legitimate or valid as originals. To be honest, I don't really care about any of that. What I care about is how we regard the results of such a scenario. Do we treat them as being, sort of equivalent descendants of the ancestral mind that went into such a procedure, or do we regard them as being not distinct, but unequal in some way, that they can make different claims to who they believe they are, who they hold that they are.
And that's where it starts to get kind of sticky. I guess for some people, I don't know. It could just be that we've been talking about this kind of stuff for years. But I take a scenario, for example. Let's say a non-destructive scan. Okay, so I'm still around, and now there's this new guy, right? So we got cyberphil, wakes up in a new substrate, feels exactly as connected to all my memories as I currently do. See, in the scenario, I can't help but be biological Phil. Although I like that in the book you say put yourself in the place of the guy in the new substrate, and I think that's really important to do. So I start thinking about that. Okay, so here I am. I'm cyber Phil. How do I feel about it? Well, to me, I'm just this guy who now woke up in a new place, right? I am the same guy I was, and I've woken up in a new place. And speaking as the other guy, as biological Phil, I don't have a problem with that. It's like, okay, I see that he is just as much me in a sense as I am. Now we're diverging, and tomorrow I'll be less him and he'll be less me, and so on forever. But we have a common core of memories, and those belong as much to Cyber Phil as they do to me. Great.
By the definition of the scenario, yes.
Yeah, I don't have a big problem with that. Stephen, what do you think? Would Cyber Stephen and Biological Stephen get along that well? Do you think?
Well, I think there'd be some problems because I mean, Cyber Stephen would be just we're Cyber Sherilyn. I mean, that's my wife, Keith. Where's the cyber kiddos? I mean, I'm all alone here. What's going? Got everything out there, Stephen. Biological Stephen.
Yes, well, that's
there might be some issues there.
Well, certainly at a sociological level, we can't deny that there would be major issues. I mean, you've got huge legal and social questions about how you would regard people in a situation like this.
Right.
Which I think is not to put too fine a point on it. I think that's a little.
Book, isn't it?
Sorry, I didn't miss.
That's a little beyond the scope of your book in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm going to leave it to sociologists and politicians to figure out how to deal with all this.
Right.
The question is simply, how do I put this? A lot of people listening to this sort of thing just take it as an obvious given that in a scenario you described, which is not unlike Section 2 of the Taxonomy, these sort of non-destructive scans, it seems so obvious that if the original biological person survives, then clearly they are, implicitly the original mind also, and that the other mind, the uploaded mind, is clearly less the original for some reason. This is the position that a lot of people hold. The whole point of the metaphysical presentation that I give in the second half is to lay out a line of logic by which you can interpret it completely differently. And the point that I try to make is that I would not regard the uploaded person as being less the original. The one way I often put it is I sort of think of us as being different people every single moment to moment to moment to moment to moment. And I say that both of the people after the procedure are equal descendants of a common ancestor, that neither one of them is more descendant or more bona fide. They're equal in their claim to be the identity that they're describing themselves as, essentially. And the way that I describe all of this, in order to try to justify it, is instead of transfers and instead of copies, you hinted at this earlier. The way that I describe it is splits, or another word that some philosophers have used for the same discussion is divergence, essentially. And what I say is that at the exact moment that you create two identical, physical systems, two identical brain states momentarily frozen in time, what you then have is the potential, when they roll forward in time to their dynamic next brain state and become different, what you get is a split of the mind. And I don't think anyone would have a problem with this. What people might disagree with me about is that at the moment of that split, the split is even. No one side of the split gets to make a claim that it's more the original than the other. They're just both people, both minds, both sets of memories, both identities, which feel with equal validity that they are continuations of the earlier person who underwent this procedure in the first place. The term that I used before is I refer to them having an equal primacy of claim to the original identity. It's sort of a mouthful, but I'm trying to find very precise ways of phrasing this. And that really is the thesis of the book. It's not that they're the same person. It's not that a person either fails to transfer or doesn't, or fails to copy or doesn't. It's that I think that both the words transfer and copy are are problematic. They don't really describe what's going on. A transfer suggests you move from one place to another, which I think is not necessarily true. A copy suggests that you have sort of an original and a copy, and you can point a finger at one and point a finger at the other and say there's a difference between them. You've got an original and a copy. The idea of a split is afterwards, it's not really fair to say one's the original and one's the copy. After a split, it's just even. You've got one and the other, and that's it. And that's the argument I make in the book.
I take from that, Keith, that your view of a mind then is substrate independent. It really doesn't matter whether it's on a computer or in a biological brain.
Yes,
mind is a mind.
Yes, absolutely. This falls under a segment of philosophy of mind, which is usually referred to, I think, as functionalism. Essentially, the idea that what makes you, a particular person, a particular mind, is the behavior of your brain. And I don't mean behavior the way people behave. I mean the neural, sort of conglomerated neural behavior of the brain defines who you are, not the individual neurons, not the individual atoms, not the fact that it's biological instead of computerized. None of that's relevant. And this is not the only philosophy of mind. People who disagree with it, like John Searle, really, really disagree with it. They disagree with it very strongly. It's one way of sort of conceptualizing what minds are, and it's the way that I've generally preferred.
I think from a standpoint of understanding minds, it completely works. I think when you're inside a mind, that's when it's an easy thing to talk about when you're talking about minds in general or a scenario that you're not in, right? But when you start talking about primacy, for one thing, subjectivity is always going to have primacy. That is to say, if I'm cyber Phil, right, and biological Phil and I have agreed before the split, right, that we're both co-equal heirs of this legacy of, this awesome Phil legacy, right? I think I'm still going to end up thinking of him as something along the lines of old Phil, right? You know what I mean? It's like, okay.
What if you didn't know?
What do you mean?
Yeah.
What if it were a scenario where when you both, let's say you have a scenario where imagine, and I describe in the book that it's not really clearly stated what the upload substrate is. So let's imagine a scenario where the upload substrate is a biological clone, essentially. So you submit to, let's say, anesthesia. It makes things easier to analyze if you're unconscious. Let's say you're unconscious, and what they do is they make a biological clone of you down to the neural level, not just a genetic clone in sort of the modern science way, but they copy your entire brain state. And you both wake up, and the surgeons don't tell you who's who, and they never do. The two of you are just left to figure it out. What do you do?
I think of myself as the real one, and him as a pretty good guy. That's right. I mean, because subjectively, that's where I'm going to be, right?
That's fine.
Old versus new. It's just like, well, it's the solipsism, right? It's the fact that I know I'm having consciousness. I don't know you guys are, right? It's the same kind of thing.
It's totally subjective, which is, again. Another point I press is that it is really defined by the subjective claims of the agents involved. One point that I really try to make is that no one else gets to dictate who's who. So you don't get to look at the results of somebody else's upload and point at the original and say, there's the valid mind, and point at the upload and say, oh, he's just a copy. As not one of the subjective participants, the rest of us are just precluded by philosophical definition. We're ontologically incapable of, or I think unentitled to make that designation. Now the two of them can sort it out amongst themselves.
Right.
But each of them, of course, according to the terms of the thought experiment, which posits that it actually does work properly, they are each going to be really, really convinced that they're the original.
I mean, no matter how generously you want to be, right? Being subjectively one person is always going to feel different than. It almost goes without saying. There's a primacy of subjective experience that you can intellectually put aside, but I don't think you'd ever fully be able to put aside, right? That anybody who's having the experience would say, "Well, I'm the guy," but. In some sense, even if they intellectually rejected that notion. But I agree with you that that's fair for you to believe about yourself. but you don't go getting you don't have the right to lay that judgment on anyone else, right? That
absolutely.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And going back to Stephen's argument, it seems to me that in a non-destructive scan, two different substrates scenario, I wonder if having the original body wouldn't provide some primacy in a legal sense, if in no other sense. You know, you were talking about let the sociologists work that out, and I think they will, right? I mean, this stuff will come up. I was thinking about this the other day. I got to meet Mike Shanahan a couple weeks ago. He used to be the head coach of the Denver Broncos, and I got to shake Mike Shanahan's hand. And I was thinking, okay, so Cyberphil and I both have that memory, and Biological Phil, we both have that memory of shaking his hand, but I've still got the hand, right? You know what I mean?
But 7 years later, you don't. All the atoms have been completely replaced anyway at some point in your future. What does it really mean to say you're the one who held his hand and the other one didn't? Right?
Daniel Boone's axe, right? I got the hand.
This is the infamous ship of Theseus. But I mean, and people will say that a ship of Theseus sort of argument says, well, you do get to lay that claim because you traded out those atoms, slowly, where the other one, kind of never had that slow continuation. You can make an argument like that, but you can also lay out a philosophical argument, but that doesn't really make any real difference to the identity. That once the whole system is replaced, that person essentially no longer exists. And
right.
Whether, and there's another term that really didn't come up until quite late in the talk. This comes up in these mind uploading debates a lot. Is the ship of Theseus example comes up all the time, and really there's no way to convince anyone about it. People have a particular philosophy of mind, and they enter into debates pretty much incapable of changing their minds about how they interpret the ship of Theseus. And that's fine. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, so long as people just sort of go into it, realizing that's what it is. You're unlikely to change someone's mind about it. You're just going to have an interesting, invigorating discussion about it. Where I would say it's worth, where I would say there's grounds to make, which is what I try to do with the taxonomy, is while people, are unlikely to really convince people to change their minds about these things, you can recognize that some scenarios can be logically paradoxical, and that somehow you've got to resolve these paradoxes in order to make your personal philosophy of mind, remain stable or valid, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, it does. And I really got a kick out of thinking these scenarios up, and I think we could probably drum up 7 or 8 more of them if we wanted to spend the whole night doing it. But I guess it ultimately comes down to, as an instance of a mind, you have kind of a slant on this thing that you got to think like a type, or you've got to respect the type idea. You've got to respect the or the process, the temporal idea of it, to really understand what you're saying about minds. And once you grasp that, sequence day by day by day, there's a lot of ins and outs of what actually happens in the interchange between those two entities, or those 100 billion entities, right? As you were, what happens then, Stephen, when there's 100 billion of you, right? Sherilyn gets her pick of 100 billion guys, right? The bottom line is, it's ultimately it's a sound idea to say that the one is just as legitimate as the other.
Well, I'd like to think that it comes across sounding sound. It reduces a possible risk of prejudice in a sense, where we might hold certain people to be of higher value or of higher legitimacy than others. And I understand what this kind of speculation sounds like to people who don't take it too seriously. You really got to make sure that people don't think you're too crazy. I realize that this sort of technology won't be available for a while, so really getting hung up on ideas of prejudice and whether we would treat uploads as sort of slaves or something is, I personally don't take it too seriously either. I think it's far enough out that we've got plenty of sociological issues to concern ourselves with right now that we don't have to worry about that. So I wouldn't want anyone to think that I think we need to start laying down actual laws or legislation about this. I just don't think I think that's ridiculous. But
When do you think it will become important? Not just philosophically, but day to day. Do you have a timeline on that? Or?
I prefer not to get in that business. There are people like Ray Kurzweil who really sort of clearly enjoy and also feel confident in that business of making predictions about when technologies will emerge. I have no particular reason to think I'm any good at it. I haven't made a whole pile of predictions in the past and then come back to see whether I was right. So I just don't get into that game. I mean, it's obvious that since I'm the kind of person who thinks about this enough to write books about it, I'm optimistic about the prospect of it, but I really don't know when it's going to happen, frankly.
Fair enough.
Let me throw out just a quick theory, Phil. I think there's a fair chance that we legally will have to deal with AIs before we have the problem of uploads. And
we might, depending on how it pans out,
Yeah, exactly.
And once we've granted personhood to AIs, maybe the legitimacy of the quote unquote copy won't be as big an issue. Maybe we'll have
already settled it.
Yeah, jumped the big hurdle by then. All right, well, we're actually past the hour, so this is going to be airing, I think, on a 90-minute show at this point. So let's dig into some other topic. No, I was just going to say that Ben Gertzel, our good buddy Ben, was good enough to introduce you to us. Keith, are you guys working on anything together? What's up with Ben?
We're not close enough friends that I know exactly what he's doing at any moment. He tends to be quite the jet setter, from my understanding.
Oh,
he always seems to be in another country every time I hear from him. I haven't known him for very long. He has been incredibly helpful in getting me some support and assistance from Humanity Plus for the book, essentially. Really, and I had only had very little interaction with him before that. I've written 2 articles for Humanity Plus over the past few years, and that has been sort of the extent of my involvement. But I've known, I'm actually not sure how to pronounce his last name, Randall either Kern or Cohen. We've been friends for ages. He was in Merg, so I knew him back in the mid-'90s. And Randall is more deeply involved in the overall sort of community. He's a neuroscientist and has been working on whole brain emulation and substrate-independent minds for quite a while. So he knows more people than I do, and he knew Ben. And that sort of represented something of an introduction between me and Ben, and then Ben was enthusiastic about my book. My book was an immediate follow-on to an article I wrote for Humanity Plus back in March. So I sort of used the article to, as an introduction for the book that I was trying to write. And, Ben really liked the book. I think he just thought it was an idea that was described in a way that he thought was described clearly enough that he wanted to help me out. So, he's been very, very helpful.
He's a good guy that way.
Yeah, he was very friendly.
He is. Well, and I'm glad you mentioned Humanity Plus, because I don't think we said that up front. This book is actually a publication of Humanity Plus, which is just more credibility, I got to say.
Yeah. I co-published it with my own imprint, but it's really the only work I did from a publishing point of view is sort of it's one of these sort of modern self-published style systems where basically I do, or we, Humanity Plus and I, would delegate between us to do the work of actually doing the page layout and the formatting and making sure that the book is actually prepared for publication. So Humanity Plus and I worked back and forth on that, and then what their tremendous assistance to me has been is primarily, what we're doing here right now is they've put me in contact with people that can help me present these ideas to a wider audience. So I was tremendously appreciative for that.
Fantastic. Well, I think this book deserves the widest possible audience. I hope everyone listening will follow the links over on blogtalkradio.com or worldtransform.com and check it out. Get yourself a copy. It's not that expensive, and it is absolutely well worth the read. Keith Wiley, thank you so much for being with us on the program tonight, and we look forward to talking with you again sometime very soon, I hope.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Stephen, what's our music going to be tonight?
Our music tonight is "You Remind Me" by Charlie Cat.
Charlie Cat with You Remind Me. Well, thank you, Stephen, for putting that together. Thank you all for being with us. We will be back again next week with an all-new show. And until next time, live to see it.
1, 2, 3, 4.
I was hoping to have arrived by 32, but many adventures and never get good till halfway through. This is my story. I'll start from the top as most folks do, to try and stay with me, because it only gets good when I find you. I was a mess, yeah. You didn't care, you took my hand, 'cause many adventures that never turn out the way we planned. This is our story, it's you and me from here on out. And that was the first time that I found out what true love's all about. The way you speak to me is so unique to me. The way you show me that there's more in this soul life to think about. 'Cause you remind me that when we're down, we're not knocked out. You remind me to smile even when you're not around. You remind me that we should live but never dwell. You remind me to love, to forget about yourself. I was trying to be the best that I could be, but many intentions make it hard to look past the things we see. Tell me a story that doesn't involve a shining night, 'cause it's hard to be strong when I feel that I'll never see the light. 'Cause all I do is wish I break my promises. You have told me that it's not the things we do, but who we are. 'Cause you remind me that when we're down, we're not knocked out. You remind me to smile even when you're not around. You remind me that we should live but never dwell. You remind me to love, to forget about yourself. The way you speak to me, so unique to me. The way you show me that there's more in this soul life to think about. 'Cause you remind me that when we're down, we're not knocked out. You remind me to smile even when you're not around. You remind me that we should live but never dwell. You remind me to love and don't forget about yourself.
Support for this podcast comes from the Utah Office of Tourism, announcing the Four Corners School's Canyon Country Discovery Center, offering hands-on exhibits, educational tours, and a variety of field-based hiking and rafting adventures. From day trips to week-long adventures throughout the Colorado Plateau. Nearby attractions include Canyonlands National Park, Hovenweep National Monument, Natural Bridges National Monument, Monument Valley Tribal Park in Cedar Mesa. FourCornersSchool.org. Support for this podcast comes from the Utah Office of Tourism, announcing the Four Corners School of Outdoor Education. Located at 7,100 feet near the base of the Abajo Mountains in Monticello, Utah, the school's Canyon Country Discovery Center campus is an ideal location for your next tour or vacation. They invite you to visit and learn about Utah's unique canyon country through day trips or week-long adventures. More at FourCornersSchool.org.